Good morning. So today we start a new quarter. Many thanks to Jeff for doing such a good job with Romans in the winter quarter. And I'm going to split this spring quarter into two halves, two different topics. We'll have a topic from the Gospels in the second half. But for this first half of the quarter, I want to see if we can get a little deeper understanding of just a handful of New Testament passages where the New Testament speaker or writer is having to address some concepts in his audience that come basically from Greek philosophy. We don't have to dive too deep into Greek philosophy in order to understand the passages, but we'll get an understanding. What was Paul talking about? What was John talking about at the beginning of his gospel when he talks about the logos, or the word? What was the author of Hebrews addressing? And we will take a look at some of these passages, and I think we'll get a deeper understanding. I think they'll come alive a little bit more. The goals are just to understand, just enough to understand what the New Testament writers were addressing. And also those Greek philosophical ideas seeped into Jewish thought. And so there was a certain tendency among Jews by the first century to have mixed their religion with some Greek philosophy ideas. And that proved problematic in certain ways. And so that had to be addressed by New Testament writers. Now, first, most famous example that we start out with these first couple of weeks, Acts chapter 17. You'll notice I put a question mark next to Mars Hill. Was Paul standing on top of Mars Hill? That's actually a matter of translation and interpretation. We'll see that. But beginning in verse 16, we're going to see Paul's arrival in Athens, after having come from Thessalonica and Berea earlier in the chapter. And beginning in verse 16, it says, "While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was troubled within him when he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with those who worshiped God, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there." That was a great place to go to meet people and talk to them. Go to the big marketplace in the middle of town. That happened a lot with Paul. Then also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers argued with him. Some said, "What is this pseudo-intellectual trying to say?" Others replied, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign deities, because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection." So we already have here some references to dive into. The translation I read from said pseudo-intellectual. A lot of your translations probably say babbler. What's this babbler trying to say? The origin of the Greek word actually came from, if you picture a chicken out pecking at the ground. In other words, it's kind of an idiom that we might translate in English as bird brain. What's this bird brain trying to tell us? You know, that's basically what they're asking here. And resurrection. The interesting thing there is that it says he seems to be a preacher of foreign deities in the plural. Well, now that's kind of an interesting misunderstanding, because obviously Paul's only preaching one God. But the Greek for resurrection, anastasis, was also a woman's name. And so when Paul said, "I'm here to preach Jesus and the resurrection," I'm here to preach Jesus and anastasis, they might have misunderstood that, oh, is that a god and a goddess or something, before they got into the message and understood it. Just like that, from that word, there's a woman's name in the Slavic languages, Russia and so on, Anastasia. It actually means the resurrection. It's a name. And so they might have misunderstood what Paul was saying, but they were curious enough to where they wanted him to come explain. But what does it mean? It said, some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers heard him and came to question him. Who are these people? What are their philosophies? Well, Stoic philosophy was all about how to live your life, how to control yourself, how to live morally and ethically. And so it actually had a lot in common in terms of lifestyle with biblical Judeo-Christian morality. There was a point of contact here. And they also had other points of contact. The Stoics believed that there was a single creator, and they didn't really focus on any other gods in the Greek mythology. So having a strong concept that there's one creator, and also that you should live in a certain moral way, at least gave some common denominator for Jews and Christians and Stoics. But there were major differences. And Paul, in order to be honest, and this is something we're going to get into next week, in order to be honest in presenting the gospel, you've got to not just talk about what you have in common with someone. You have to be honest and say, however, this gospel I'm preaching to you has points of difference with Stoicism. There's things that you Stoics believe that we don't believe, and we're going to have to get to that. We can't hide that. Now, Epicureanism, we'll talk a little bit about next week. For the rest of today, we're just going to talk about Paul addressing the Stoics and trying to connect to the Stoic. And he starts out with the common denominator that he has with the Stoic audience. But before he finishes, he will move on to things that they're not prepared for, that they don't believe. So let's look at the next couple of verses, 19 and 20. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus and said, "May we learn about this new teaching you're speaking of? For what you say sounds strange to us, and we want to know what these ideas mean." Okay. Now, the Areopagus, we know from ancient sources, was a kind of a council of philosophers. And sometimes they exercised some gatekeeping as to who was allowed to get up and speak. And so when they hear Paul out there speaking in the marketplace, and people seem interested, they want to know, partly for their own curiosity, and partly they want to be able to openly agree or disagree and influence the crowds. Now, Areopagus is a name that comes from a place, Mars Hill. But by the time of the first century, by the time Paul was speaking, Areopagus was the word that was used to refer to this group of philosophers. It's a group of people, not a place. And so when it says, in fact, they no longer met like they did centuries earlier on top of Mars Hill. It seems like they had a building right off of the marketplace, right off of the agora. So what you can picture is they're in their building debating their philosophy and so on, and they hear Paul outside talking to everybody. And they come out to investigate. And then they invite him, "Come on in before us into our building. We want to ask questions of you." Verse 21 explains something about the atmosphere in Athens here. "Now all the Athenians and the foreigners residing there spent their time on nothing else but telling or hearing something new. Now, in a group like that, some people really want to understand. Some people are open to new ideas. Some people, though, it's going to be a matter of idle curiosity. They'll hear what you have to say, but they're not really looking, to commit to anything. It's kind of hard to reach people who are just idly curious and not really ready to commit to any new truth. And that's true of philosophy in general. Philosophy in the Greco-Roman world was all about how to live. And one of the things that we kind of have a hard time understanding is that the ancient religions, the pagan religions, were really not about how to live. They were sacrifices and rituals and so on. They had their temples. They tried to appease the gods and goddesses and gain favor with them. But they didn't have strict codes of conduct. They didn't really address that. Within the religions of their day, it wasn't how do you conduct yourself. It was, here are these pagan rituals to go through. How to live. What's the truth about how you should live? That's philosophy in the Greek world. So the philosophers and the priests and so on are two very separate groups. The philosophers are trying to get you to commit to living better. However, there are some who sit around and debate philosophy who aren't really ready to commit to anything. That's just a matter of idle curiosity. But isn't that true of religion also? Aren't there some people today where the faith is a matter of debating and arguing and idle curiosity and let me understand this and so on, but not let me commit to living my life according to it? That's a pitfall in human nature, to just be idly curious and never commit to something. And that's something that Paul faces in this crowd. There are people who are willing to hear him, but not all of them are really all that open to hearing anything. Now, the next verse, verse 22. Then Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every respect." Now, this is another way that we know that you don't stand in the middle of the top of a hill. In some translations, you'll see that translated Mars Hill, but that's really, I think, the wrong picture here. I think he's standing in the middle of the group of philosophers, probably in their building just off the marketplace. The King James Version also says superstitious instead of religious, but that is not a good translation of that Greek word. And furthermore, it'd be kind of odd, wouldn't it, for Paul to start out by insulting them? Actually, centuries before Paul, when someone got up to speak philosophy, it was kind of customary to start out flattering the audience. And eventually, the Areopagus, the council of philosophers who were kind of the gatekeepers, forbid that. No more flattery. Paul doesn't go as far as flattery. He respects them, so I can see that you're religious, but he doesn't get into flattery. Now, philosophers were on kind of thin ice sometimes in the society in Athens, because philosophers are very different from pagan religions. And the philosophers weren't really focused on the deities. So philosophers were always one step away from being accused of being impious, from being accused of undermining the religions that people believed in. That got Socrates killed a few centuries before. And so this is something very touchy to the philosophers. So Paul starts out saying, I can see that you're religious. That puts them at ease. He's not delivering an accusation against them. They're not atheists. they believe in God in some sense. Not in the way that we do, as we'll see, but he's saying, okay, here's a point of connection. I see that you're religious. You believe in a creator, at least, so on. Verse 23, for as I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I even found an altar on which was inscribed, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. Now, it turns out there's some historical background here for these altars. Long before Paul, a couple of centuries before, there was a plague that was sweeping through Athens. And so everybody went off to their pagan altars and started offering sacrifices and trying to appeal to gods and goddesses to end this plague. And it wasn't working. The plague was going on. And so, kind of in desperation, they built several altars around in Athens to an unknown God. You know, kind of like, who knows? Maybe we'll hit the jackpot. You know, maybe there's some God who's in charge of this plague that we can appeal to, and we don't know who it is. And so they started offering sacrifices on these altars to an unknown God, and the plague ended. Coincidence? You know, maybe so, but not in their minds. In their minds, actually, somehow this unknown God had ended this plague. And so they decided to make these altars permanent. And a couple of centuries later, they're still there, and Paul comes across them. And so they're, in a sense, perhaps they're still kind of waiting to hear who is this unknown God who's more powerful than all these other gods and goddesses, you know, who could apparently end this plague on us. And when Paul comes through, he sees these altars. And that's an opportunity for Paul to connect to them. He says, you know, what you worship in ignorance, I'm here to tell you about. You're right. There is an unknown God more powerful than all your pagan gods. I'm going to give you a new understanding of that. Now, verse 24, Paul says, the God who made the world and everything in it, he is Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in shrines made by hands. Now, Paul is echoing Old Testament language here. God does not need buildings made by our hands to live in. He certainly doesn't need us to make any statues of him with our hands and so on. But this actually connects directly with what the Stoics believed, because a lot of them, you know, they believed in a single creator God, and a lot of ancient philosophers were kind of converging on this idea that however many gods and goddesses there might be, surely only one of them is responsible for being the creator of everything. The others control who knows what, but surely there's only one creator. And so Jews were in the habit of trying to proselytize, by the first century, proselytize these Greeks and tell them, we know who the creator is. Let us show you our scriptures and we'll tell you about the creator, starting from Genesis 1. And the belief, this common denominator that there has to be one creator, was an opening for Jewish proselytization. And that's why among other reasons, why there were Gentiles who were interested in Judaism. When Paul travels around in the book of Acts, we hear the phrase in some of the synagogues where he went to preach, the God-fearing Gentiles. There were people, Gentiles, who came and attended the synagogue and heard the teachings. They didn't go so far necessarily as to become proselytes. They didn't go through circumcision and proselyte baptism and so on, but they kept coming. They kept attending and learning, and they were attracted to the high moral standards of Judaism. That fit in with what they had learned from their own philosophers that have a high standard of how you live. And they were attracted to the single ultimate creator God concept because they were ready for that. And Stoics in particular emphasized, and this is where they start to get into a little thin ice with respect to those pagan religions, God doesn't live in temples made by hands, right? He doesn't live in those pagan temples. Now, they better be careful how they say that in public, or they end up like Socrates, where the people rise up and say, he's undermining the religion, and kill him. But Stoics actually believed in a form of what we would call pantheism, which is, as opposed to a creator God who's separate from all of the stuff he's created, the creation is all a part of the God. It's a concept you find in Eastern religions too, Hinduism and so on. So this is a point of departure. This is not part of the common denominator of Christianity and Stoicism, but this is something that Paul will have to deal with. But he can phrase it in terms of something that is common denominator. He's going to get later in this speech to the points of difference. But right now, Paul is still at the section of his speech where he's emphasizing the common denominator. He doesn't believe God lives in temples that we make with our hands. And neither do the Stoics. In fact, that's a big emphasis from the Stoics. Now the next verse, 25. Paul says, neither is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. Now this is a big emphasis of the Stoics. God needs nothing is a phrase that they used over and over. Once again, that puts them treading on thin ice with respect to the pagan religions around them who are trying to appease those gods. They better not get too explicit, God doesn't need those sacrifices you're altering to him and so on. But that's what they believe. That's what they believe in their writings. And so this is definitely a nice point of contact, a nice common denominator between what the Stoics believe and what Paul believes, what Christians believe. The Stoics tried not to attack the pagan rituals of their day. They just didn't have any interest in them. The rituals were not needed as far as they were concerned because deities don't need anything, and so they just tried to be quiet about it and ignore pagan rituals. They didn't participate in them. They didn't go to the pagan temples and so on. But they weren't going to publicly attack them for their own safety. Verse 26, Paul says, from one man he has made every nation of men to live all over the earth and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of where they live. Now, this was something also that the Stoics agreed on. The Stoics agreed that the Creator put everybody where they are and intended them to be these different nations and so on. But Paul is slipping in some new language here. He says the creation started with one man, from one man. That's not how the Greeks talked about creation. That's Genesis language, but that's not really Stoic language. And so Paul is starting to transition a little bit towards something new to the Stoics, which, in order to be honest in his presentation of the gospel, that's what he has to do. And there's a lot else that could be said about the Stoic view of creation. Because they believed in pantheism, they believed all kinds of things that Paul's not going to get into right here. They believed that all the physical creation is part of the Creator, pantheistically, and so It's a physical emanation from this non-physical creator. And they believe that every so often at great periods of time that everything would get burned up and dissolve back into the creator, and then the creator would start all over and do another creation. And so they had this cyclical view of time with multiple creations that go on and so on. None of that has any point of connection with Paul. He doesn't get into it right now. Finally, up through verse 29 is where we're pretty much common ground still. This is a famous part of the passage that's been commented. So that they might seek God and perhaps they might reach out and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Being God's offspring, then, we shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image fashioned by human art and imagination. Now, that last part is an obvious connection here to the Stoics who don't believe that God needs our statues and our temples and so on. But there's some interesting quoting going on there. There was a Greek poet, Aratus, and Paul is directly quoting from him, for we are also his offspring. And the interesting thing is we have found Jewish texts from back before this time in which Jews were teaching each other, how do you proselytize the Greeks? And Jews were instructed to try to seize upon this common belief in a single creator. And in those texts, they have this exact quote from the poet Aratus. Talk to the Greeks and emphasize to them, they believe that we are the offspring of a creator. Use that as your opening to talk to them about God in Genesis. Paul, I believe, was a very educated man in Jewish circles. Paul was probably educated in exactly those texts, among others. Paul was familiar with this strategy, so to speak, of how to reach the Greeks. And so it's not any coincidence. What we're seeing here, Paul speaking to the Areopagus, Paul's prepared for this moment. He's been prepared for this moment for years. He's studied how do you connect to Greeks. Because he was educated in those texts. There's also a paraphrase, for in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. That first part is a paraphrase of another Greek writer, Epimenides. So Paul is quoting poets that the Stoics accept, and he's connecting with the common denominator. They believe in a creator. They believe the creator doesn't need anything from us. He doesn't need our statues, doesn't need our temples, and so on. So far, Paul has connected with the common denominator. But now that's going to have to come to an end, starting in verse 30. We're going to see next week, Paul's going to start talking repentance and judgment day and the resurrection from the dead and so on. And at this point, he's going to lose most of his audience because they're not prepared for any of that. But once again, one of the things we'll talk about next week is being honest in our presentation of the gospel. We might seek common ground with people, but we've got to be honest that there are certain things Christians believe that non-Christians don't necessarily believe, and it's new to them. They have to be addressed. That's what Paul does. So, thank you for your time. We'll see you next week.